At 72, Agatha lived alone, rejected by her children and forgotten by the majority. But when the village in which it lives faces an unprecedented crisis, it is the one who carries the solution. In an act of courage and wisdom, the old woman reveals a secret that no one expected, challenging her own nature and surprising everyone. In a small village in the heart of the United States, surrounded by mountains and dense forests, lived a 72-year-old lady named Agatha. She had white hair, her skin wrinkled by the passage of time, and a deep wisdom that seemed emanating from her silent looks. A resident of a simple wooden house, she spent her days in lonely company, crochet, and taking care of the garden that, despite arid conditions, flourished like a miracle. Its story was marked by moments of happiness and pain. Agatha had 3 children, but for years had no contact with any of them. The distance was slow, almost imperceptible. First, the children began to move away after the families themselves graduated. Then the visits diminished, until finally Agatha was alone. His world was now going through the presence of the neighbors, who respected it, but did not approach often. Many saw her as a mystery figure, a woman who, despite her advanced age, seemed to carry a silent force, an energy that challenged her own nature. But there was something else. Deep down, a sadness was hidden. A secret she kept, something that has become clearer in recent days. The village where Agatha lived was facing a silent crisis, something no one could understand completely. Water supply was decreasing dramatically, and the source that supplied everyone was about to dry. The scarcity of resources was becoming increasingly visible, and people began to wonder how long they could survive there. It was in this desperate scenario that one day Agatha's phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line was of a local authority. The tone of urgency was evident. "Agatha, we have a big problem. The water source is about to dry, and if we don't do something soon, the whole village can be destroyed. We are looking for an urgent solution, but no one here has an answer. No idea what to do." Agatha, with the calm that characterized her, responded with a simple but surprising, "I know what we need to do." Everyone in the city was waiting for a solution, but no one imagined that the elderly woman who had all left aside could be the key to saving the village. Agatha has always been a silent woman, but with a presence that no one could ignore. His modest and simple house was located on the edge of the village, away from the busy streets and the trade centers. She liked the solitude, but she knew that over time people were starting to look at her with pity, as if she were just an old woman waiting for the end. Agatha's children, after growing up and moving to large cities, stopped visiting it. The first to move away was Stephen, who, after marrying, disappeared completely, claiming that his new life consumed him. Emily and Mark, the other 2 children, followed the same way, and with that, Agatha got used to loneliness. She spent her afternoons cultivating flowers in the garden, plants that seemed to insist on blooming even without much water. The village, which was in the mountainous region of Colorado, was known for its beauty, but also for the difficulties it faced, especially with natural resources. The main source of water, located in the mountains, provided water for the entire village. However, the scarcity that now reached the source was something never seen before. Something bigger was at stake, and everyone knew it. The residents of the village, many of whom had inherited their lands of past generations, were beginning to despair. The solution seemed impossible. They had tried everything, drilling in search of other sources of water, rationing, but nothing had worked. Gradually, they began to leave the city in search of better living conditions. However, some, especially the older ones, like Agatha, would rather wait for an answer, for a miracle. Agatha's phone, which rarely played, started playing more often in recent days. She answered with a calm voice, but the requests for help and the messages of despair were clear. The city was on the edge of the collapse, and it was in one of these links that the head of the city council, a man named Derek, sought it out. "Agatha, what do you think we can do? No one has an answer, and we are wasting time. People are leaving, commerce is closing, and we don't know how long the village will hold no water. Do you already have any idea?" Derek's voice was loaded with tension. In the background, Agatha could hear the sound of the wind hitting the trees and the murmur of her own plants swinging. She always had a way to hear more than the obvious, to realize what was not being said. After a long silence, she responded with peace of mind. "I know what should be done. I just need them to trust me. Let me work, and I will show you that there is still hope." Derek, surprised, did not know how to react. Agatha had never been boldly to expose her ideas, but he somehow felt that she knew what she was talking about, and perhaps out of despair, or for a last attempt to save the village, he agreed. "Agatha, whatever, you have my trust. Just tell me what you need." In the following days, Agatha began to move in a way that no one expected. She started meeting with other older residents of the village, those who still remembered the stories of the past, legends and ancient rituals that had been passed from generation to generation. Meanwhile, the younger people wondered, how could such an elderly lady unconnect and apparently without resources? Could she be so safe that something could be done? What they didn't know was that Agatha, with her life of silent experiences, carried a deep knowledge about the earth and the nature that many had forgotten. Her secret had been kept for years, something she had learned from her own mother, and now seemed to be the key to saving the village. She knew that often the solution was in the simplest things, the practices that time had devalued. As the days passed, Agatha dived even deeper into the ancestral knowledge she had, something many would call superstition or outdated practice, but she knew how to be true. The answer to the village crisis was actually hidden in the roots of the land itself. Local legends spoke about an ancient invocation ritual, a way of restoring balance with nature that has been set aside for generations. Agatha knew it would not be easy to convince others to trust something that seemed so mystical and outdated. After all, most people in the village were used to science and the logic of modern solutions, but she didn't have time to argue. The water level was increasingly low, and the pressure was increasing. She started preparing the terrain. First, he asked all older residents, those who still carried some memory of the tradition, gathered at their home. When they arrived, Agatha looked at them seriously. "What I'm going to ask you to seem strange, but it's our last chance. We need to perform the lost source ritual, something that was set aside because many no longer believe. But I know it can work." The faces of the old residents were skeptical. Some looked at each other as if they were wondering if she had gone crazy. But Agatha, with a firmness she had never shown before, continued, "The earth here never abandoned us. We forget about her. If we do this right, we can bring the water back. It is not magic. It is an old knowledge that was lost." She convinced them to gather around the mountain source, a sacred place for the natives who lived there before them. Agatha guided them in a tortuous path through the forest, a path she knew as the palm of her hand. They reached the top of the hill, where the source began to dry, and began to prepare the place, following the footsteps of the ritual Agatha had taught. Meanwhile, the younger residents of the village, with their logical and impatient minds, observed at a distance. They doubted. How could they believe that an old ritual could really solve the problem of lack of water? Some, uncomfortable with what they considered a waste of time, began to comment with each other. "This is crazy. What does she think she's doing?" muttered one of the young women, Sarah, who was accompanied by her husband. "We should be looking for alternative sources, not moving these old legends." But there was something in Agatha, something that made everyone around him shut up. A stillness, a confidence that was impossible to ignore. Something in the way she walked, as if carrying the weight of a truth that she only knew. Gradually, the group began to join the source. Agatha then started singing. It was not a song she knew, but a soft melody that came out of her heart. The other residents, hesitant at first, began to follow their example, singing softly as their eyes closed. Agatha guided them. The words she pronounced seemed to intertwine with the sound of nature around them. The trees, the wind, even the animals in silence seemed to hear the song and join the ritual. The tension in the air was palpable. The heaven, once of course, began to cover himself with dark clouds. And then, something unexpected happened. The sound of the water, which once seemed distant, began to hear. A slight murmur came from the source, as smooth as a breeze. Agatha smiled but kept her calm. "Don't stop. Continue." And they continued. Suddenly the water murmur became stronger, more urgent, until finally the source began to gurge again with an impressive intensity. Water began to sprout with a renewed force, spilling from the source, feeding the channels they had dried, and flooding the region alive. Residents began to look at each other, surprised, almost not believing what they saw. The water was back, flowing with the same abundance that the village had known in better times. Meanwhile, the younger ones, who had watched at a distance, were dumbfounded. Sarah, with wide eyes, approached Agatha, who was now on her knees feeling the water with her hands. She looked at Agatha with a mixed expression of unbelief and gratitude. How is this possible? She asked, almost speechless. Agatha, with a quiet smile, looked at her and answered softly, "Sometimes we forget what really matters. It wasn't magic, honey. It was faith. Faith in ourselves and on the earth that always sustained us. With the return of water, the village was saved. The sources began to gurge with a renewed force, and the families, who were previously panicked and prepared to abandon their lands, could now breathe relieved. Life in the village followed its course, but the implications of what had happened began to spread like a silent fire. Agatha, who was once seen with a certain distance and even pity, now became a central figure. She, who had been neglected by her own children and often ignored by other residents, gradually gained the respect she deserved. Some saw her like a heroine, others as a mystique, but all, without exception, could not deny that it had been the key to the salvation of all. However, the water miracle brought more than just a solution to the immediate problem. He brought out old tensions that had been latent in the village for years. The figure of Agatha, with his ancestral wisdom, now aroused a growing curiosity, but also a certain fear. The biggest challenge for her was not the village crisis or the scarcity of water, but to deal with the personal demons that had been hidden in the solitude of recent years. Among the residents, Sarah, the young woman who had doubted the ritual, was divided. She felt a mixture of shame and admiration for Agatha. Her husband, Tom, was more practical and skeptical, always believing that solutions needed to be based on reason. While Tom tried to convince Sarah that the return of the water had a scientific explanation, she couldn't help but feel that there was something deeper involved. She began to visit Agatha more often to better understand what really happened in the heart of the elderly. On a fall afternoon, Sarah approached Agatha's house, which was on the edge of the forest, surrounded by trees that now seemed to have a different energy. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but something compelled her to find out more about that woman. Agatha received her with a quiet smile, as if waiting for her visit. There were no initial words, but a simple invitation to enter. The air inside the house had a feeling of calm, as if time passed differently there. Agatha sat in her usual armchair and indicated the side chair to Sarah. "Sit, honey. Let's talk." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but eventually settled next to Agatha. The silence was broken by the elderly woman, who surprisingly began to talk about her past. "You know, I always had a very strong connection with the earth. My mother taught me to respect her, to understand her signs, but deep down, all the knowledge we pass on is lost over time. People start to think it's all fantasy. Worst of all, when you need what you have learned the most, no one else believes." Sarah, touched by the words, did not know what to answer, but what she felt in her heart was something that neither the reason for her husband nor the scientific explanation he sought so could contest. There was something beyond the logic in Agatha, something of a depth she was beginning to understand. "Agatha, I always thought that all you did was too old to be real. But now, seeing all this, I don't know what to think." Agatha smiled, as if she knew that this moment of understanding would come. "What you thought, honey? It's not wrong. The truth is that each of us carries its own history. Sometimes the truth comes from places we can't imagine. What I did was not a miracle. It was just a memory of something that should have been kept. Time makes things forget, but the earth never forgets." At that moment, Sarah felt a strange connection with the woman, something that made her rethink her worldview. Agatha was not an eccentric old. She was a guardian, a door for a knowledge that few could understand. It touched Sarah deeply, something she knew would need to lead to the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Tom, suspicious of the power that Agatha seemed to have about his wife, began to question his own values. He didn't want to believe something that seemed so far from reality. But at the same time, I could no longer ignore the signs. The water, which was once disappearing, was now gushing with an inexplicable abundance, and the village was thriving again. What should he believe? The reason or feeling that something bigger was at stake? The village seemed to revive, blooming again with the abundance of water. The air was cooler, the plantations spread, and the residents' laughs echoed the streets again. But while everything seemed to go back to normal, there was a growing weight in Agatha's heart. Something was wrong, something she felt deeply, but couldn't explain. One morning, after weeks of peace and prosperity, Agatha got up before dawn. I felt an urgent need to go to the source where the ritual had been performed. Something told him that he should be there, as if the earth, who had previously welcomed it, is now trying to give him a message. She walked through the silent forest, her hands touching the trees as if seeking some confirmation of what was to come. Upon arriving at the source, she stood, observing the water flows with its renewed force. But something caught your attention. There was something different in the water. It was not the purity she had seen before. It was as if the water had a slightly dark color, and as it approached, a shiver traveled his body. The murmur of the water seemed denser, almost as if whispering something to her. It was then that she realized. The water was not just the water it had restored. Something was eroding her and she couldn't ignore it. The village was still being sustained, but the earth was beginning to react, as if the balance had been broken. At that moment, Agatha heard footsteps behind him. It was Sarah who, after many visits, felt that something was wrong with the woman who now considered her mentor. She approached Agatha, not knowing what to expect. "Agatha," Sarah started, hesitant. "I felt something was happening. You look different." Agatha did not respond immediately, but looked at Sarah with a seriousness she rarely showed. Her eyes were loaded with silent wisdom, as if she were trying to absorb all the possibilities. "Something is changing, Sarah. The earth, the water, should not be like that. The water we brought back is not the same. I feel that nature is trying to warn us." The wind, which was once soft, began to increase, and the sky, which was clear until then, suddenly darkened with heavy clouds. Sarah, feeling the dense air and the change around him, asked, with a trembling voice, "What is happening? What should we do?" Agatha closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the words she needed to say. She didn't want to be a carrier with bad news, but she knew the truth needed to be revealed. "I made a mistake, Sarah. I thought the ritual would be enough to restore balance, but in doing so, I ended up releasing something from the land that should not have been awakened. There is a price to be paid. The water that saved the village is now contaminated. And more than that, she has brought a strength that we are far from understanding. The fear that until then was hidden in the hearts of residents now spread like a shadow." Sarah looked at the water, and then to Agatha, trying to understand what was going on. The elderly woman, with her ancestral knowledge, now seemed more vulnerable than ever, and the village, which had been saved by her, was now facing a threat that no one could predict. "So, what can we do?" asked Sarah, his voice loaded with anxiety. Agatha took a deep breath and with a heavy sigh replied, "What we did was necessary to save the village, but now we need to return to Earth what we took. There is no way to change what happened, but perhaps we can correct the error. However, this will require more than a simple ritual. We need all the residents of the village, their faith and their strength to restore the balance that was broken." Before Agatha could continue, an explosion of light burst into heaven, and the earth shivered slightly. Something was approaching, something unknown and powerful. The birds raised flight on a bus and the wind blew so hard that Agatha had to cling to a tree so as not to be knocked down. Sarah, now completely scared, looked at Agatha, who, although visibly affected by the situation, still kept her calm, unwavering. She knew the battle that would follow would be more than a fight for water. It would be a struggle for the village's own survival. And as the sky was darkened and a new threat was beginning to manifest itself, Agatha understood that to save everyone, she would need to make a greater sacrifice than anyone could imagine. The village, which until then lived a renewed calm, now faced a new tension. The sky, loaded with dark clouds, seemed to reflect the panic that was beginning to spread among the residents. The earth, which was once in balance with restored water, now seemed to be in conflict with itself. The air was heavy and the floor trembled gently, as if something underground was moving. The first signs of the change came the night that the village was surprised by a strange noise from the mountains. It was like the sound of a distant scream, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the bowels of the earth. At dawn, the water from the previously restored source now showed signs of contamination. The water, which previously gushed clean and abundant, now had a cloudy color and a strange odor, a smell of poisoned earth. The news spread quickly, and soon, the entire village was panicked. The families who had celebrated the return of the water were now fearful. The elders, who had always believed in ancient stories and rituals, began to whisper about the mistakes made. The younger ones, who initially doubted Agatha's wisdom, began to look at her suspiciously. Sarah, who was with Agatha when the secret was revealed, ran back to the village, desperate, trying to gather the other residents to understand what to do. She knew the answer was with Agatha, but when she arrived, she found a village in a state of chaos. Agatha was right. She screamed as she ran the streets. "We have to go back to the ritual. The earth is asking for it." But the doubt was palpable. Some residents, especially the most skeptical, no longer believed the effectiveness of rituals. They wanted to find a more realistic solution, more scientific. Council leader Derek was one of the first to take the word. "We can't follow this anymore, Sarah. The water is already contaminated. We need to act now in a practical way. We can no longer trust superstitions. We need to seek external help." But Sarah, determined to correct the error, did not go back. She knew that contaminated water was not just a physical problem. It was a sign of something much larger, of an energy that had been released by the attempt to restore balance without completely understanding the consequences. Sarah sought Agatha, who was in the house where she had all started. The elderly woman, with her deep and serene gaze, seemed to have accepted that the village faced a challenge that went beyond any ritual. She knew that the sacrifices would be needed, but the cost would be high. "I know many of you don't want to hear about it anymore, Sarah. But if we do that right, we may be able to restore balance before it's too late," Agatha said calmly, but her voice was loaded with silent sadness. She knew that what would need to be done would require more than words or rituals. She needed to go to the bottom of the mountain, where the ancient spirits of the earth slept, and ask for forgiveness. Apologize for disobeying the laws of nature, but that would require a deep sacrifice, a price she knew she should pay. That night, Agatha prepared for what seemed to be her last journey. Sarah, feeling the severity of what was going on, asked to accompany her, but Agatha denied. "This is my burden, Sarah, and if someone should go there, it must be me. I can't ask for more sacrifices from you." In the next morning, Agatha left toward the mountain. She knew that the spirits of the earth could even accept the request for forgiveness, but the sacrifice was something that could not be avoided. As she climbed the mountain, she felt the weight of what was about to happen. The wind howled around him, and the trees seemed to murmur, as if they were warning about the gravity of their mission. Meanwhile, in the village, the tension was at the height. The younger ones, like Sarah, were desperate. They saw Agatha as the last hope, but they also feared that what she was about to do were the end of everything. When Agatha reached the top of the mountain, she stopped before the old rock that, according to legends, kept the spirits of the earth. The sky was darker and the wind seemed to announce a storm. She looked at the rock and in a firm voice began to speak old words, those that her mother had taught her. Words of repentance, of humility. But the moment she finished the ritual, something surprising happened. A flash of light illuminated the sky, and the earth under her feet began to shake hard. The price Agatha was about to pay was not just symbolic, but real. She knew she could no longer go back to the village, and at that moment she understood that her sacrifice would not be in vain. The village, still in shock, spent the following weeks trying to deal with the consequences of what had happened. The water was now clean again, but something inside each person had changed. Agatha's story and his sacrifice was recorded in the hearts of the residents, who began to see life in a different way. Sarah, more than anyone else, felt the weight of the decisions that Agatha had taken. She knew that the elderly woman had made a deep sacrifice, but she still did not completely understand what it meant for everyone's future. Agatha had left without saying goodbye, without expecting applause. The wisdom and the strength she had were rare, and Sarah felt that she was now fitting her to preserve what the elderly woman had begun. Over time, Sarah began to take more responsibility for the village. The city council, which was once composed of older men and women, was now looking at her with new respect. She was no longer just representing the younger ones, but also somehow representing Agatha's wisdom. She began to use the knowledge that Agatha had transmitted her to unite the village, integrating the elders and the youngest in joint decisions. At a board meeting, Sarah first took the floor with a confidence she had never imagined to have. She was ready to apply the lessons Agatha had taught her, starting with respect for earth and natural balance. "We can't just think about quick and superficial solutions," Sarah said, with her eyes on the board members. "We need to restore the bond with nature, with the past. We must learn to live in harmony with the earth as Agatha taught us. And most importantly, we need to educate our children so that they also understand the importance of maintaining this balance." Derek, the board leader, looked at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and regret. He who had been skeptical and desired to seek more modern solutions now felt that he had been taken a wrong way. He knew that alongside Sarah, he could begin to rebuild the village in a deeper, more genuine way. "You're right, Sarah. We are in debt with Earth and Agatha. Perhaps it is time to learn to listen more than to talk. We are ready to follow your example." But it wasn't just on the advice that things were changing. In the heart of the village, people were beginning to gather in a different way. Children, once unconcerned with the importance of nature, were now taught to respect the water, earth, and season cycle. The older generations, who had distanced themselves from the old rituals, began to share them again with the new generations. Everything seemed to go through a path of renewal, when one afternoon Sarah was called to the top of the hill where Agatha had performed the ritual. The place was quiet, as always, but Sarah felt a different presence in the air. She knew she was there for more than just remembering the past. When she reached the top, the sky was clean, and a soft breeze touched her face. She sat near the rock where Agatha had made her sacrifice, looking at the village below. It was there that, for the first time, she felt a true peace. Not a superficial peace, but a peace that came from within, of a deep understanding. That's when she heard a soft voice, as coming from the wind. It was Agatha's voice, or at least something Sarah felt. "Agatha, Sarah, you carry in your heart the wisdom that I always expected you to find. Now the village is in your hands. Don't be afraid to make difficult decisions. The force is not in avoiding suffering, but in knowing how to turn it." Sarah closed her eyes, absorbing those words. It was as if Agatha was really there, guiding her, as she had always done. She knew that the elderly sacrifice had not been in vain. Now she had the responsibility to move on, to take the village to a future where the balance between earth, people, and nature was preserved. In the following months, Sarah began to implement new practices in the village. More than a simple effort to ensure that water was never scarce again, it began a renewal movement, which respected the old roots of the village, but also incorporated new knowledge. The village flourished, not only in resources, but in spirit. There was a stronger sense of community than ever, and a deeper connection with nature. The children of Agatha, who had moved away from her for so many years, began to return to the village. Stephen, the oldest, was the first to appear. He was aged and carried the weight of guilt in his eyes. When he arrived, Sarah received him with a serene look. "You knew she always waited for you, didn't you?" said Sarah without anger. "Just a peace that only time and losses can bring." Agatha knew how blind from a child could be blind, but never believed you. Stephen, with teary eyes, just nodded. He knew he had no more time to waste. The village, which one day he had abandoned, was now ready to receive him back. And so, through overcoming the loss, sacrifice, and personal transformation, the village was reborn, not only through water, but through the faith restored in its own roots. The village was in a moment of renewed equilibrium, but fear still hung in the air. Despite the apparent peace, Sarah knew something was not completely resolved. Agatha's sacrifice had restored the water, but there was still a price to be paid. The earth could not be forced to give more than it had already offered. There was something deep and unstable in the energy she had awakened, and Sarah couldn't ignore it. Over the months, the small flaws began to appear. The water, though clean, began to shrink again, and the earth seemed to begin to resent. The harvests, which initially flourished with vigor, began to decline, and the air seemed denser. Sarah knew that, although she had restored part of her balance, Agatha's sacrifice had left a gap that could not be filled with human effort only. One afternoon, as he walked through the field, Sarah was called again to the top of the hill, the same place where Agatha had performed the ritual. She felt that if there was a solution, she would need to find her there at the same point where everything had begun. Upon arriving at the rock, she noticed something different, a stronger sense of discomfort, as if the wind was trying to whisper something she didn't want to hear. The heaven, once clean and calm, was now covered with heavy clouds, as if nature itself was waiting for the final decision. She knelt near the rock, touching her surface with her palms. Something was drawing your attention, something much deeper than the surface of water or trees. Sarah closed her eyes and suddenly had a vision, a view of Agatha, smiling softly but with a serious look. She seemed to be at peace, but there was something of sadness in her eyes, as if I knew the end was coming. "Sarah," Agatha's voice echoed in his mind, "you always knew that balance was not eternal. Everything has a cycle. What we did, what we restore, may not last forever, but you have the strength to do what is needed. Sarah felt her body tremble with the intensity of the vision. She didn't know what she meant, but the message was clear. The village was on the verge of a new challenge, and she would need to face something much bigger than imagined. Deep down, Sarah knew that the village, despite her rebirth, still carried the mark of Agatha's sacrifice. And as Agatha had predicted, it was not a sacrifice that could be forgotten. The forces that had been released with water and earth were about to charge their price. As the sun was beginning to put, Sarah made a decision. She would gather all residents of the village and, with their support, would go to the mountain to try to perform a new ritual, a ritual that would not only restore water or earth, but seeking to restore harmony between the two. She knew she needed to learn to deal with the consequences of what had been done and correct the mistake that, even with the best intentions, had been made. Upon returning to the village, Sarah called a meeting. Agatha's words echoed in his mind as he prepared to speak. She gathered all residents in the central square under the large tree that had been a symbol of so many past stories. They were about to hear something that would change everything once more. "The earth did not abandon us, but we pressed it too much," Sarah began, her voice firm, but loaded with a visible concern. "What we did when trying to restore water was necessary, but now we need to restore balance differently. We cannot force nature to give us more than it can offer." Residents began to look at each other, muttering, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. Some still had doubts, but what Agatha had done, and the sacrifice she had done for everyone, now weighed on everyone's heart. "What Agatha did was more than a simple ritual," Sarah continued, now with more confidence. "She taught us about the cycle of life and death, earth and water. We need to honor this, respect the limits that nature imposes on us. If we want life to continue, we will have to do it together. Let's go to the mountain and try to restore what was lost, but in a way that respects the balance that Agatha always knew should be kept." As Sarah spoke, the wind calmed down, and the clouds in the sky began to dissipate. It was as if nature itself is listening and awaiting the residents' decision. The village knew that the way ahead would not be easy, but now, more than ever, they were united. With this decision, Sarah knew that everyone's fate was about to be sealed. The village would face a last major trial, but now, with the support of all, she was ready to do whatever was needed. The village was ready to face the biggest challenge of all. Sarah, with the strength acquired along her journey, led the residents to the mountains where Agatha had made her sacrifice. Every step toward the mountain seemed to echo in everyone's hearts. They were no longer just facing a crisis of resources, but a deep dilemma about the balance between man and nature. The connection to the earth, which Agatha had always taught, was now more alive than ever. When they reached the top of the hill where the ritual had occurred, the scenario was surprisingly different. The earth seemed to have partially regenerated, but the atmosphere was still loaded with a tension that could not be ignored. The wind, which had previously brought messages of transformation, now seemed almost frightening, howling through the trees with a force that no one had seen before. Sarah stopped in the rock where Agatha had performed the ritual, feeling the weight of the place. She closed her eyes, and for a moment everything has silenced around her. It was as if the earth is waiting for its next action. "What do we need to do now?" Sarah whispered to herself, but the words were carried by the wind, as if nature itself was responding. She knelt beside the rock, touching her surface with her palms, feeling the energy of the earth once more. He remembered the words of Agatha, his mother's lessons on how the earth and water were interconnected, and how humanity often interfered with a natural cycle that could not be forced. Sarah looked at the residents behind him. Derek, who was now beside him, put a hand on his shoulder, conveying his confidence. He, like many, finally understood that it was not only Agatha's wisdom that was vital, but the deep understanding that the balance they had lost needed to be restored more significantly, more completely. "We'll need you all," Sarah said, his voice firm. What Agatha did was not just bringing the water back, was to teach us how to give and receive from the earth wisely. Now we should give something back. We cannot demand more than the earth can give us, and we must ask for forgiveness for what we have done. With these words, Sarah began the ritual, but not the same as Agatha had done. This would be different. She asked each resident to bring something symbolic, an item that represented what they loved most and were willing to offer the earth in thanks. A tree branch, a flower, a stone, even a personal memory. Everything had a deep meaning for those who participated. As Sarah led, the wind increased in intensity, but now there was no more fear in people's hearts. They were united, confident that in doing so, they were not only honoring Agatha, but the very land that had sustained all their lives. As the ritual advanced, the earth around them began to respond. The trees, which once seemed static and lifeless, began to move slightly with the wind. The rock, where Agatha had made the sacrifice, seemed to shine in an ethereal way, as if alive and present, watching every movement of Sarah and the residents. The feeling that something grand was about to happen grew every moment, but the climax of the ritual happened unexpectedly. As Sarah recited the last words of the ritual, a huge flash of light erupted from the sky, illuminating the whole mountain. The floor trembled again, but this time with a renewed and more controlled force. It was as if nature itself was healing, as if the earth and the water were finally reconciling. When the light dissipated, something amazing happened. The water from the source, which once seemed cloudy and contaminated, gushed with surprising clarity and purity. But that's not all. The flow of water seemed to vibrate in harmony with the earth, flowing like never before. The village, in the distance, began to shine with a renewed energy, as if the roots of life had finally been aligned. Sarah, with teary eyes, looked at the residents, who were all amazed at what was happening. She knew that this was not just the end of a struggle for survival, but the beginning of a new chapter, where the village would no longer be ruled by urgency and scarcity, but by wisdom and respect for the land. Derek, beside her, looked at her surprised and said, "I never imagined something like that was possible." "You did it." Sarah smiled, but her answer was simple and deep. "It wasn't just me. It was Agatha. It was all of us. The earth never leaves us, but we need to learn to respect it, not to demand from it what it cannot give. What we did here was a joint effort. Now it is our responsibility to ensure that this never gets lost." The village was saved, but more importantly, it had found a deeper balance. Sarah not only restored the water, but restored the connection that everyone had lost with the earth. The village, now transformed by Agatha's courage and Sarah's wisdom, has flourished like never before. The water continued to gorge clearly, feeding the fields and ensuring that the harvests would grow again. But more than that, something essential had been restored: respect for the earth, the cycle of life, and ancestral wisdom. Sarah, now leader of the village, has become a symbol of transformation. Not only had it recovered the water, but it had restored the harmony that Agatha had always been able to be the key to true prosperity. Residents began to understand that true wealth was not only in natural resources, but in connecting to the earth, and the past generations they had learned to respect this relationship. Derek, who had been skeptical at the beginning, now accompanied Sarah with a new look. He and the other board members began working along with the elders of the village to ensure that what had been learned not to get lost over time. Agatha's traditions, the cycle of giving and receiving from the earth, were now part of everyone's daily life. Agatha's children, after years of removal, began to return to the village. Stephen was the first, with a regret, but also with the desire to honor the mother that he had neglected for so long. Sarah welcomed him with the same peace she now felt in her heart. "Agatha always waited for you," Sarah said with a quiet smile. "She has always believed that the earth, like people, has its own times and rhythms. Now it's your time." Over time, the village has become an example for other places. People from neighboring cities began to visit, seeking to understand the secret of their prosperity. What many saw as a simple miracle of water was actually a deep rebirth, a return to respect for natural cycles and wisdom that comes from the silence of the earth. Agatha's story, the elderly woman who had been forgotten by her children and neglected by so many, was now celebrated in songs and stories. His sacrifice and knowledge had been the key to saving all, and her memory remained alive in the hearts of the residents. On a spring afternoon, as the sun set off behind the mountains, Sarah climbed to the top of the hill where the ritual had begun. The wind, now soft, seemed to caress his face, as if nature itself was thanking for the wisdom that was restored. She knew the work was still in progress. Maintaining balance would require constant attention and effort, but at that moment she felt a deep peace. The village had found her way, and she knew that, like Agatha, she also carried a responsibility to ensure that future generations never forgot the true meaning of what she meant living in harmony with the earth. Years passed, and the village continued to prosper, now eternally marked by Agatha's wisdom and Sarah's legacy. Future generations grew up listening to the stories of the woman who, in her loneliness, had saved them all. Stephen and the other children of Agatha, now dedicated to the village, took care of her mother's legacy. The balance between the earth, the water, and the people was still respected, and the village flourished as an example of harmony. Sarah, now older, was looking at the horizon with the certainty that the cycle Agatha had started would never be forgotten. The story of Agatha and Sarah reminds us that true strength comes from our connection with the earth, the wisdom of past generations, and the sacrifice for a greater good. Now, more than ever, we need to hear and respect what nature teaches us. Share this story. Inspire others to reflect on what really matters: the balance, the wisdom, and the transformation that comes from within. Let us together create a more harmonious world where each gesture, every decision respect the cycles that support us. The future is in our hands. What will you do with it?